My name is Tori Hoffman, and I am proud to call myself a social journalist. For the past year and a half, I've been working with boys and men of color between the ages of 12 and 28 as they navigate what it means to be a man. And together, we created Boys Will Be, an engagement project that redefines and reimagines what masculinity looks like. But first, a little bit about me. I've been drawn to journalism for years. I even served as the editor of my high school yearbook. That's me in high school. And I served as the editor at the same time that one of my classmates entered my school with a shotgun, killing another student before killing himself. I actually won a national award for this book for our coverage of our shooting and the community response. But rather than focus on my reporting on gun violence, I wanted to focus more on the root causes of violence. And I thought of how the violence perpetrated by mostly men signals a larger problem about masculinity. So I started digging, and I found out that I wasn't the only one thinking critically about this community. Earlier this year, the American Psychological Association released its first ever guidelines for treating boys and men. While there had been previous guidelines for women and girls, gender nonconforming people, older adults, and even for certain issues, there were not any guidelines for working with boys and men. So this changing narrative around working with men in psychology also signals that there's a time to change how we talk about it in journalism. And given the current situation of men's health, I think it's time to interrogate the gender identity. Men commit 90% of homicides and represent 77% of homicide victims, making their demographic the most likely to be involved in a violent crime. They're 3.5 times more likely than women to die by suicide, and their life expectancy is 4.9 times shorter. So I knew I wanted to work with this community, but I didn't know how. So I went to I started doing more research, and I set up Google alerts on topics related to this community. I put together a Twitter list to track certain hashtags and certain people talking about healthy masculinity and issues related to men. I also, in the first semester with my lovely classmate Danny, conducted a social experiment in Bryant Park. We, in the middle of the holiday gathering, we set up and we invited passersby to share a word that came to mind when they described what it means to be a man. In that experiment, I found that men either described a very idealized, stereotypical man, or they didn't know how to answer at all. And I was left wanting to speak with more people and to speak with them together to see how strangers sharing their experiences could learn from each other. So I looked for online spaces of men self-gathering, and I found people gathering on websites like these. But what happened, one Reddit and 4chan, was a lot of toxic communities existing because these allow for people to use very strong language while remaining anonymous. But while I didn't find boys and men self-gathering online, I did find other resources, both from local and national organizations, at least trying to talk about this subject. So in my internship this summer, I had the privilege of producing 5 stories from pitch to publish, but the 5th one was especially special because my supervisor knew that I was working with boys and men of color, and she got me out to Long Beach, where I covered a 2-day training on combating domestic violence through community healing. So that was hosted with the Alliance for Boys and Men of Color at PolicyLink, where I interned, and A Call to Men. So not only did I learn about community-based solutions with adult men, but I also learned about the teaching resources that A Call to Men offered. And as soon as I got back to New York, I sat down and took their online certification to lead discussions with boys and men. And this led me to these boys right here. So I felt prepared to talk about this subject. After all, I'm a woman, so I did my research. But this led me to East New York. I wanted to go to a community that had been underserved by the media, and I wanted to find places where boys were already convening. So I looked for community groups and school programs, and I found Public School 292. I connected with their middle school and high school levels, but I showed up without a pen and paper, and I showed up consistently, just developing relationships with the boys. And I realized that middle school boys do need to see you a lot to have that relationship with you. So that is why my community relationships are deeper than they are wide. But I realized with them that just building community was the need itself. So I developed a video series that records 3 different group discussions among boys. It's broken down by age group. So with them, 12 to 14-year-olds, 15 to 19-year-olds, and 20 to 28-year-olds. In those group discussions, I needed the trust that I had built with them by showing up for them to be able to open up and talk about their gender identity. Among each other, they united around what it means to be a man, and they reimagined what masculinity could look like for themselves. And in each discussion, I developed ground rules before we talked. Everyone used I statements and spoke from their own personal experience rather than making generalizations. And I gave them a paper survey at the beginning and end of each discussion to track how the discussion changed their attitudes and behaviors. So those group discussions are the video series on YouTube and on my website. In addition, I've compiled articles and other resources for men and feature profiles and other tangential stories. This is a quote from Navi, who participated in one of the conversations. And I was affirmed by this because he said we need more spaces like these. And I even have a group discussion that's happening after graduation because the boys asked for it. So I will continue to engage my community on social media, to retweet and share people who are promoting less rigid expressions of masculinity, and to do engagement like this, to see what issues boys and men want me to keep reporting on for them. My project is named after a phrase that we all know very well. Michael Kimmel, who kind of pioneered masculine over 20 years ago, he said in an interview, "Why don't we say boys will be boys when a man wins the Nobel Peace Prize?" And he's right to ask, because the phrase boys will be boys is often used to excuse problematic behavior by boys and men rather than to celebrate their successes. So boys will be aims to reimagine that and reframe that and to say boys will be who they are. And in the future, Deep Center, a community-based organization in Savannah, Georgia, has just received funding to continue work like this. And I have a scheduled meeting with them next week over the phone to see how we can partner in the future. So when you think about the boys and men in your life and you want to share their successes or just discuss healthy masculinity, use the hashtag #BoysWillBe, and I will be tracking it.